In today's story, I want to share something that still feels unreal every time I replay it in my head, because it started with something so painfully ordinary that most people wouldn't even notice it. Yet it escalated into police cars outside my home, neighbors whispering behind half-closed doors, and the slow, uncomfortable realization that sometimes the biggest threat to your peace isn't a criminal hiding in the shadows, but a self-appointed guardian who thinks the world needs saving from people like you. I moved into that house looking for quiet, not secrecy, not drama, and definitely not conflict. Just a small two-bedroom place on a suburban street where lawns were trimmed to regulation height, and everyone pretended to be friendly while secretly monitoring each other's lives like unpaid security cameras. I worked from home as a freelance editor, which meant my days were long, screen-heavy, and irregular, with deadlines stretching late into the night and mornings starting whenever my brain decided it was ready. Because my home office faced the street and the sunlight hit my monitor at an awkward angle, I kept my curtains closed most of the day, partly for focus and partly because I didn't enjoy the feeling of being watched while I worked. A feeling that, in hindsight, wasn't paranoia at all. Across the street lived Karen and her husband, a couple who seemed to believe that living in a neighborhood gave them shared ownership over everyone else's choices. Karen introduced herself within a week of my move, standing on my porch with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, asking what I did, how often I left the house, and whether I lived alone, all framed as casual conversation, but delivered with the precision of an interrogation. Her husband stood slightly behind her, nodding along, saying very little, the kind of man who let his wife speak for both of them while he silently endorsed every word. At first, her interest was subtle enough that I could pretend it was harmless comments about how quiet my house was, jokes about how I must be a vampire because she never saw me open the curtains, questions about the packages that arrived every few days from my work. I laughed politely, answered vaguely, and assumed that, like most nosy neighbors, she would eventually get bored and move on to someone else. What I didn't understand then was that for someone like Karen, boredom isn't solved by distraction. It's solved by suspicion. The street had an unspoken routine, people leaving for work at the same time each morning, returning around the same hour each evening, curtains opening and closing in predictable patterns, and my schedule didn't fit neatly into that rhythm. I'd step outside at odd hours to take calls, work late with the lights on, sleeping when projects allowed, and most importantly, keep my curtains closed during the day. To me, it was nothing more than personal preference, but to Karen, it was a mystery that demanded an explanation. And when she couldn't get one from me, she invented her own. I found out later that she had been talking to other neighbors, framing her curiosity as concern, asking if anyone else thought it was strange that my house was always dark, that I didn't seem to go to work like normal people, that I received so many deliveries, that I didn't socialize on the street. The way she told it, she wasn't gossiping, she was protecting the neighborhood. And by the time those conversations reached me secondhand, the story had already grown into something unrecognizable. The day everything came crashing down was a Tuesday, ordinary in every possible way, and that's what makes it stick in my memory so vividly. I was deep into a long edit, headphones on, curtains drawn tight against the glare, when I heard a knock at the door that immediately made my stomach drop. Firm, official, the kind of knock that carries authority with it. When I opened the door, the police officer stood on my porch, calm but serious, one of them asking my name while the other glanced past me into the dim interior of my house, as if he expected to see something illegal glowing in the shadows. They told me they were responding to a call from a concerned neighbor who believed suspicious activity was taking place at my address, specifically mentioning that the curtains were closed all day, that there was constant activity inside, and that it looked like some kind of operation. Hearing my own private habits described like evidence in a case file was surreal, and for a moment, I genuinely wondered how something so absurd could feel so threatening. I invited them in, my hands shaking despite knowing I had nothing to hide, and watched as they took in my workspace, the stacks of papers, the open laptop, the half-empty coffee mugs, the completely unremarkable reality of a person who worked from home. They asked questions, routine ones, what I did for a living, how long I lived there, whether anyone else stayed with me, and I answered honestly, trying to keep my voice steady while anger and disbelief churned underneath. After a few minutes, one of the officers sighed softly, the tension draining from his posture, and said, "This seems like a misunderstanding," in a tone that suggested he'd seen versions of this before. Situations where fear was born not from facts, but from imagination. They apologized for the disturbance, explained that they had to respond to any call like this, and left me standing in my doorway with the echo of their presence still lingering in the air. What I didn't expect was Karen watching from across the street, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, not relieved, not embarrassed, but disappointed, as if the outcome hadn't lived up to the dramatic story she had built in her head. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small nod, the kind people give when they believe they've proven a point, even when reality says otherwise. That night, the emotional weight of the day hit me harder than I expected, because it wasn't just about the police showing up. It was about realizing how easily someone else's paranoia could invade my life, how fragile privacy really is when someone decides you don't deserve it. I couldn't stop thinking about how close this could have come to something worse, how a slightly different officer, a slightly different tone in the call, could have escalated the situation beyond awkward questions and apologies. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the street shifted. Neighbors who used to wave now watched more carefully. Conversations stopped when I walked by, and I understood that, even though nothing illegal had been found, the seed Karen planted didn't simply disappear. Suspicion, once introduced, has a way of lingering, especially in places where people mistake conformity for safety. Eventually, I confronted her, calmly, directly, standing on my own porch while she stood across from me with that same tight smile. And I told her that calling the police over closed curtains wasn't concern, it was harassment. She defended herself by saying she was just looking out for everyone, that you can never be too careful these days, that if I had nothing to hide, I shouldn't mind the attention, and in that moment, I realized there was no reasoning with someone who believed their fear gave them the right to control others. I didn't move out, and I didn't change my routine, but I did learn something valuable, something I wish more people understood, that privacy isn't suspicious, difference isn't danger, and being quiet doesn't make you guilty. The curtains stayed closed when I needed them closed, and every time I pulled them shut, I reminded myself that living your life on your own terms will always bother people who believe everyone else exists to follow the same script. This wasn't just a story about a neighbor calling the police. It was a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be disrupted by misplaced authority, how easily fear turns into accusation, and how important it is to protect your right to simply exist without explanation, even when someone across the street is convinced that your silence must mean something sinister.